It seems that we spend our lives comparing and competing incessantly. We push and we pull silently, posturing and posing, as we try to show that we are valuable and worthwhile. We set up systems of value and privilege certain behaviors and chastise others. Life seems to be one long game of justifying ourselves, whether we play it safe and keep to the straight and narrow, as good church people do, or walk the path paved with good intentions that we're told leads to hell and ruination. Also what good church people do. Today's readings seem to bear this out. In the reading from Jeremiah, we discover a binary choice between blessing and cursing. God's word says, "Cursed are those who trust in mere mortals and make mere flesh their strength, and whose hearts turn from the Lord. And blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is in the Lord." As such, we're presented with two pathways, two ways of being. The way of cursing is pictured as a shrub in the desert that shall not see relief when it comes, but will live in parched places of the wilderness. Whereas the way of blessing characterizes the path as a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream, not fearing when the heat comes, because its leaves shall stay evergreen, and it shall unanxiously and continuously bear fruit. When presented so starkly with two pictures, I wonder who wouldn't choose the path of blessing? Who wouldn't choose to put their trust in God? And I think that's where the choice breaks down. For in the following verse, it says, "The heart," on the cusp of Valentine's Day, "the heart is deceivious above all else. It is perverse. Who can understand it?" This makes me wonder, are we even able to choose the path of blessing at all? We may think we've chosen it, but we may be deceived by those good intentions. So what are we to do? How can we be sure to find a way to sustain ourselves with that water, that living water that God provides? I think our predicament is a little bit like Tevye in The Fiddler on the Roof, trying hard to do the right thing as he alternates between what makes sense on the one hand before considering the other hand, only to consider the other hand, and then the other hand. Pretty soon he's got too many hands at all, and his hand is already forced. If you don't remember how The Fiddler ends, I'm sure that Maddie DeJoy or Mackenzie Pickett or McKenna and Ruby Schneider will be selling tickets to the JHS musical. There you go. Commercial break ends there. But isn't that how we find ourselves, faced with impossible choices? Of course, life's paths are confusing. It reminds me of the directions that Yogi Berra once gave to get to his house. He said, "You go down the street, and when you come to the fork in the road, take it." I love that. It speaks to the impossibility of our choice. When you come to the fork in the road, take it. In the gospel, Jesus continues to present life in terms of blessing and of woe. And his portrayal is more shocking than Jeremiah's tree, for the paths seem to be flipped. It is those in the path of woe that are experiencing all of the abundance, all of the richness, all of the fullness. They're not parched. No, they're laughing. They're enjoying the best of life. But Jesus seems to suggest that this is merely a temporary condition. Instead, he says the path of blessing is characterized by scarcity, sorrow, and poverty. What do we make of this? Who would choose blessing if it's just sorrow? It might seem that Jesus' sermon in Luke's gospel is all about flipping the tables, announcing blessing to those who are poor, in poor estate, while pronouncing judgment upon those who are well off and secure. That Jesus is just inverting the status quo, making the first last and the last first. On the surface, it appears that the goal of the sermon is to make the uncomfortable comfortable and the comfortable uncomfortable. That's how it seems, right? And I don't know about you, but I've gotten a sudden flush of discomfort myself, for I have a whole bunch of stuff, and my life is pretty easy. And Jesus' words remain powerful, and they're addressed to us. I think they strike with such force because they speak to the impossible situation we find ourselves in. We want to choose the path of blessing. But as Jeremiah contends, the heart is deceivious above all else. It's perverse. Who can understand it? Most of us want to choose that right path, the one of blessing. But too often we find ourselves living in hierarchical systems of power, where we're seemed forced to make preferential treatment of those who are in power. It's a meritocracy. We've been taught to seek higher levels of status. That's how we find value. That's how we know we're winning. We know we're more greatly rewarded when we have premium or platinum status levels. And so we aspire to those things, trying to rack up points on our credit cards or what other scenario we have to do. We've come to the fork in the road, and we've taken it. And yet in Luke's gospel, these important words are not spoken on the Mount, the Sermon on the Mount, as they are in Matthew's gospel. No, the text is quite clear. Jesus came down with the 12 disciples and stood on a level place. There is reason that the text tells us that Jesus stood at a level place. He's modeling something for us, something that none of us really want to accept or believe to be true. We don't really want to be on the same level. If that were the case, the rich would not be as rich as they are, and the poor would not be as poor as they are. Having to stand on the same level as those whom you've deemed less than, or even more than, is just too much to imagine, too much to bear. And at the end of the day, it's just not how the world works. We create value and forge identities for ourselves by finding someone, anyone, to look down upon. And I think that's precisely the point that Jesus is making. He's calling into question the process through which we create value. He's exposing our heart, which is deceivious above all else. I believe that this sermon on the plain, on that level place, is designed to make all of us uncomfortable, whether rich or poor, full or empty, laughing or weeping. It doesn't matter on which side of the divide you find yourself this morning. The gospel confronts all of us. It confronts and it invites us to build a different world of valuation. Jesus is inviting us to cultivate a new heart, the very heart of God inside of us. I wonder, what might that look like for us to have a different heart? I want to return to that image in today's reading from the Hebrew Scriptures of that tree, the image of that tree planted by streams of water. I recently listened to a podcast about ancient trees in the Pacific Northwest. They both blew my mind and also presented an image of the kind of existence that God is calling us to. Perhaps the kind of heart that God would grow inside of us if we were willing. In your mind's eye, join me in that ancient forest filled with towering, old-growth trees that reach hundreds of feet into the sky. Standing on the forest floor at the base of those massive trunks, you can see other smaller trees and vegetation growing. It's pretty dark, but light does kind of get down. If you were to dig and pull back the soil, you discover roots of all those trees and how they're deeply connected and intertangled. The forest itself is connected in one living ecosystem. In fact, some have even begun to talk about the forest possessing a consciousness. And like us, the forest is at war with itself, creating a system of valuation and fighting for resources to grow, striving to gain access to water and those ever-important phosphorus and nitrogen molecules that fuels their growth. Since all trees need these two basic building blocks, scarcity is the name of the game, especially come springtime. Now you'd imagine that these big ancient trees are the best at scooping up the resources before the smaller, poorer trees can gain access, which is why they're so tall. And surprisingly, you would be wrong. That is not the case at all. Researchers recently uncovered a mystery of how these trees grow so big, and it doesn't occur at the forest floor, but up in the canopy. Suspended hundreds of feet in the air, researcher Nalini Nadkarni often called Queen of the Canopy, studies the canopy ecosystem that contains 50% of all terrestrial life. 50. Yes, up in the branches of these ancient forests, she's discovered all sorts of creatures. She's found trees growing on trees, blueberry bushes, worms, a species of salamander that spends its entire life suspended 100 feet in the canopy, in the air, and even an exclusively aquatic creature called the copepods. Copepods happen to be the most abundant animal in the ocean, and they're a huge part of the diet of baleen whales. Of course, the thing that makes all of this possible is the rich, fertile soil that over the years and generations has developed on the branches of the tree itself. Soil that's 1, 2, 3, 4 feet deep in places, smelling as rich and as pungent as the soil in your garden. Well, Nalani was digging around the soil. She discovered a strange system of roots, some as big as her wrist. She couldn't quite figure out to which plant they belonged. So she did her best Sherlock Holmes impersonation and followed the evidence. And by now you've probably already guessed that these ancient trees discovered the rich presence of phosphorus and nitrogen in quite an unusual place, right on their own arms, on those branches extending out. That these trees adapted roots up in the canopy, roots up in thin air, as it were. As such, these big trees can leave the phosphorus and the nitrogen in the soil on the ground below for the smaller trees to prosper and grow. It's amazing. And it got me thinking, might this be a parable for us as well? What does it suggest for us human folk and our own ecosystem? How might we alter our system's evaluation that address the inequalities of life and also the fickleness of the human heart? Can the trees teach us to discover the practices that create woe for all of us and instead prompt us to choose to participate in a more just ecosystem, God's ecosystem? I think using the trees as a metaphor keeps us from clear-cutting society and cutting us all back to the forest floor. Instead, we're able to see the world differently where we are, whatever our capacity or station in life happens to be. I think Jesus is inviting us to attune our hearts to trust that God is providing all that we need, all the nutrients we need for growth. This morning, perhaps, we can change ourselves. We can adapt like the trees and look and find ourselves to find God's blessing here in our midst, in unusual places. For a blessing is really just a new way of viewing the world, seeing with fresh eyes, seeing things that are possible that would otherwise appear impossible. I wonder, can we find and live into God's blessing this morning together? Maybe we can. Can I invite you to do something? Would you all stand up for a second? I want to invite you to stand up and to make eye contact with someone that's not in your family, someone you're maybe not too familiar with. Make eye contact. Literally, turn around, do what you have to do, make eye contact with somebody. Look eye to eye. I know it's uncomfortable to make eye contact with someone we don't know, but make eye contact. Take a few moments to establish silent eye contact between you. And now I want you to say to your partner, you are a blessing. You all are a blessing. This is what God is telling us. Today, may you remember that you've been blessed, and now go be a blessing for someone else. Amen. Remaining standing, we'll say the Nicene Creed now.